C.S. Lewis, who wrote a series of books called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series. He was a fairly well-known author, British author. He was also a devout Christian. And actually, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe book series was about Christianity. It was his attempt to, the lion figure who was killed and resurrected was Jesus. And it was an attempt to make Christianity understandable or appreciable to a new audience that might not have been born with Christianity, to present it in a way that would be almost seductively attractive, that people would feel attracted to Christianity and the narrative of Jesus without necessarily even being aware of it. Who's familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It's pretty much a classic. If you were born in the U.S., you would have read it for sure. Anyway, he also wrote a number of other. He wrote a book called The Screw-Tape Letters, and he wrote Mere Christianity and a number of other really penetratingly insightful books about his understanding of religion and spirituality. And sometimes he would deal with difficult issues that would confront spiritualists in general and specifically Christians. Like I remember, for example, to give you an idea of his line of thought, he one time said that I do not believe that hell is locked from the outside. I believe the door to hell is locked from the inside. Which, what does that mean? You guys are nodding your head. What does that mean? Yeah. Okay, we're keeping ourselves in hell. What big problem does that solve? Yeah? The devil. Okay, I don't really know. It's a complicated enough question. If you give me a one-word answer, it's an automatic fail. So you failed twice. All right. So the answers have to be at least a sentence or more long, and they have to not require me to understand the topic better than you to make sense out of what you're saying.
Means you can get out.
Means you can get out. That's true. What problem does that solve? Yes.
It solves the problem of evil because it means that God is not leaving it so that we can't get out of hell ourselves, and in fact, it's our own.
There you go. It's an attempt to deal with the problem of evil. That an all-good and all-powerful God would create an eternal place that you were locked into, irrespective of your contrition or your remorse or anything you might do in terms of penance. That's a pretty big problem for Christianity, the existence of hell. The devil's kind of a side issue on this. It's the existence of an eternal place of damnation. By saying the door to hell is eternally locked from the inside, it means that God is never condemning you forever, rather you're condemning yourself. It's a simple statement. It's a simple single sentence. But if you understand Christian theology and the problems that affect Christianity and attempt to seriously reconcile their vision of the world with their vision of an all-good and all-powerful God, it's pretty penetrating. It's pretty insightful. On the other hand, he wrote a book called The Screw-Tape Letters, which is about a demon sitting on a person's shoulder on one side and an angel on the other, and how all the bad stuff that you do was caused by somebody else giving you bad advice, which I think represents a real impoverished understanding of personal responsibility. And it's very underwhelming. That you can blame the devil made me do it, and blame the devil for everything bad that happened, and take no responsibility yourself. Anyway, he's such a famous guy and so well known that his personal letters to other people were published posthumously, because that's how important of a writer he was and important of a thinker he was for enough people that his estate published his personal letters as, as something that would be of interest to the public. And I remember reading one letter from him, and he said, I would love to discuss philosophy with a Hindu. And you have to remember he was in England, and Indians have been in England for a long time. Let's say for the last, 150 years or so. And so, whereas in the U.S., our diaspora Hindu population has only been here for roughly 50 years, 60 years. They repealed the Immigration Act in 1965. It was an anti-Indian Immigration Act. And so in the 1880s, 1890s, there was a lot of logging going on in the Pacific Northwest, old growth redwoods and such. And they brought in Punjabis to be loggers because they worked for cheaper than white people. Just like they brought in Chinese people to build the railroad. And even nowadays, we bring people up from Mexico and they do work that white Americans may consider to be beneath them. And so this is, anywhere you go, this happens. Pakistanis in the UK, Turkish in Germany, every country has the people they bring in to do the work they don't want to do. Singapore, they bring in South Indians. Anywhere you go in the world, they'll have this. Also from the Philippines, we also bring people in from the Philippines. They'll bring a domestic class of people in to do the work that they don't want to personally do themselves. And it maybe isn't quite as bad as indentured servitude, but it definitely creates a laborer class or a second class that's treated usually nowadays through difficult immigration situations. They end up getting treated truly like a subclass with less rights than the native-born population. It's not always like that. Like when Islam came to Spain, Islam conquered Spain in the 8th century, and when Islam came to Spain, they made the Spanish second-class citizens. And through, essentially a theocracy, the establishment of Sharia law, independent of the desires of the population, they made Islam a state-sponsored religion, which was not the religion of the indigenous peoples, the Spanish. And then the people who did not follow Islam, they were dhimmis. They were treated as second-class citizens. And they had to pay the jizya, which was a tax, to practice an antagonistic religion. You were not allowed to build any new churches. The churches that you did have, you were not allowed to repair. And so the other religions which were permitted to exist on some level were in a constant state of disrepair, and they were constantly discriminated against. And in India, in fact, this led to large numbers of people converting to Islam simply because they couldn't afford to practice their chosen religion. And so you could say it was a passive-aggressive way of preaching. You just made it very, very difficult to practice the religion of your choice, and then people would gradually convert to your religion simply because it made their life easier. You didn't have to pay the jizya. There's stuff, you could not give testimony against a Muslim. So you couldn't say, for instance, a Muslim raped me or something like that. You couldn't say that. It would have to be testimony given by a Muslim against a Muslim. A non-Muslim could not give testimony. There's a bunch of stuff like this that just made you a true second class. And in that case, it wasn't based on somebody not being indigenous to an area, somebody not being native born. but it was based on you not believing the right thing and not being part of the conquering colonial class. On another level, this was done by the British whenever they colonized a country. They treated the indigenous population like second-class citizens. In fact, we did it. It's a weird twist of fate, but we view the people we import to do the labor we don't want to do as second-class citizens, but then we came and ejected through genocide the indigenous population of the U.S. Through something called Manifest Destiny, where we essentially walked from one side of the country to the other and killed or subjugated everybody in our path, the Native Americans who've been living here for longer than anybody has a record of. That's how long they were here. Like since the last ice age or something like that. So anyway, the British had a long history with Hinduism. C.S. Lewis would have grown up around Indian people. The same way if you're from Southern California, you grew up around Mexican people. There was an indigenous population of native-born people, Anglo-Saxon people, but then they brought in immigrants to do some of their labor for them. And for a time in the UK, that was Indians from India. Eventually became Pakistanis. And of course, they were bringing them in Pakistan and India were one country. They were only separated in 1947. And so C.S. Lewis would have grown up around a lot of Hindus. And so then you can appreciate his comment. He said, I would like to get to know the Hindus and discuss their religion with them, but I can never get them to take a stand on any issue. This is in his writing, published. And I think he's thinking that's a defining feature of Hinduism, that Hindus are masters of doublespeak and equivocal language, and their religion is so poorly defined and so poorly understood even by its practitioners that you can't get them to agree to any position. That wasn't actually what it was. That rather, socially, Indians, and honestly most people in most old world cultures, in most old world civilized places that aren't used to slavery, which there never was any slavery in India. It was always, any slaves in India were brought in by the Muslims when they conquered India. There was no fundamental slavery going back in India's history. They had something like indentured servitude, but they had no actual slavery. But when you look at any great civilization, Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, they didn't just win wars and subjugate other people. They usually have a very refined way of dealing with each other. And so it's quite common when you talk to an Indian person that you'll ask them a question and they'll want to say no to you, but it's an interesting feature of American English that when you want to agree with somebody, very often you will say, no, yeah. Someone said, do you feel like Mexican food now? You'll go, no, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's go do that. We're so wired to argue that even when we want to agree with someone, we'll preface it by disagreeing with them. And it's so hardwired that nobody even notices it. It never comes up. What a weird feature of American English this is. That you want to agree with someone, they say something that you agree with, and your gut reaction, just out the gate, a visceral reaction, almost like a parasympathetic reaction. It's innate. It's preconscious, is you say no. As someone who wasn't born in the U.S., have you noticed this weird feature of our speech? It's bizarre, right? And of course, in India, when people want to they want to agree with you, but when they want to disagree with you, what will they say? Ji no. They'll say yes, no. Because they're civilized, not weird people. who don't have some kind of, I don't know, partial antisocial personality disorder, where they're just incapable of getting along with their fellow man, so they have to regularly pepper the conversation with disagreements for no good reason. In fact, in India, it's the opposite. You'll say, ji na, yes, no. So if somebody says something you don't want to do, you'll say yes, and then you'll say no. And you'll agree with them, and then disagree with them, so that you're not being totally rude and just saying no. In fact, the more respectful you are, the less likely you are to disagree with them. So anyway, what C.S. Lewis saw as a deficiency within Hinduism was actually just Indian culture. And that when he would loudly and aggressively put forward his theories of Christianity, the second-class citizens who were afraid that he might violently assault them, like they've been getting violently assaulted by white Englishmen for a century, chose to just take a very conciliatory, non-aggressive, non-violent communication approach to dealing with them. And it vexed him such that he thought that Hinduism had no definitive beliefs. Do you follow this? Meanwhile, in the real world, India, practically speaking, wrote the book on religious polemics. And for thousands of years, they've been engaging in rigorous philosophical debates with other schools of thought that all coexisted in the same place. Even the idea of Hinduism is a misnomer because it assumes that there is one fundamental umbrella term which can house all of the different belief systems which coexisted in ancient India. And it's based on an assumption that the whole rest of the world must be like Christianity, where they have a Nicene Creed, and it's an amazing degree of uniformity within Christianity, that whether you're Orthodox or Coptic or you're Protestant or what denomination of Protestant Christianity or you're Catholic, if you look at the Nicene Creed, which is a document which has been around for 1,700 years, since 325 AD, you'll find almost all Christians believe the Nicene Creed. There's an incredible degree of uniformity within Christianity, in spite of its hundreds of denominations. You actually find the same thing with Sunni Islam, an incredible degree of uniformity. And you do not find that within Hinduism. For sure, if you look at Shaivism and Vaishnavism, the two main sects of Hinduism, and so if you look at Shaiva Dharma and Vaishnava Dharma sounds more like Christianity than it does like Shaiva Dharma. In other words, Vaishnava Dharma has more in common with Christianity than it does with Shaivavad, or the belief of tens of millions of pious Hindus. And so you've got these two schools of thought that may have nothing in common, that may in many ways be diametrically opposed to each other, but you got to force them under one term, Hinduism, which traditionally simply meant that you lived on the eastern side of the Indus River. Hinduism was a term used by Persians, it's not even an indigenous term, to refer to anyone who lived on the eastern side of the Indus River. And so it's equivalent to saying, what's your religion? Oh, I'm from the Midwest. Or I'm from California. What's your religion? Oh, I'm California. We would think it was such a stupid thing that we would assume that everyone in the whole state of California would believe the same thing. But that was a mistake that was made by the early Indologists who took a Christian framework and tried to force it on top of indigenous Indian belief systems. Meanwhile, before that was done, and that's just now being undone, when I went to school and studied Hinduism, that was still the norm. But in the last 20 years or so, since after I got out of school, this has been getting corrected in textbooks. in ancient India, there was a robust, multi-millennia tradition of debate that went on, where schools defined themselves rigorously in relationship to other schools, agreed on the points that they agreed on philosophically, and then also would highlight the areas where they disagreed so they could have a really good argument. Half the time we argue with people, we don't even know what we disagree about. It's more just some sort of ego match than it is an actual disagreement on some concrete issue that you're able to figure out. And sometimes you'll even wonder, what are we even arguing about? You get caught in the weeds, and you pretty soon you don't even know what you're arguing about. Polemics, in terms of a serious field of study, is the rigorous defining of your position vis-a-vis other positions such that you can engage in a serious conversation. It's argumentative, it's antagonistic, but it's done according to rules, just like a formal debate system, where you have to have a proposition and one person takes the affirmative and the other person takes the negative, and then you decide what will count as evidence, and then you engage in a back and forth. This, in ancient India, thousands of years ago, got written down. It got written down. And it got written down in a series of texts called sutras. Sutra means thread. And the sutra also means aphorism. An aphorism is a very short, tight, terse, philosophical statement that really defines something. But it's so tight that they even get rid of any extraneous grammar. So it's just I think, therefore I am, would be a classic aphorism that you would all be familiar with in English. I think, therefore I am. What that actually means is, I'm doubting whether or not I exist. I'm having an existential dilemma. I'm wondering about the nature of existence. And I'm doubting whether anything truly even exists out there or not. I'm having this perennial existential moment. I'm trying to fathom that. Something which everybody worth their salt has thought about for as far back as you can look in time. And I'm realizing that in order to doubt whether or not I exist, I have to think. And that my very ability to doubt my existence means I think, and therefore that I exist. And thus I can dispose with the question about whether or not I exist, because merely by wondering whether or not I exist, I've concretely proven that I do in fact exist. I think, therefore I am. It's a simple statement, but it packs a wallop philosophically. It's a very profound statement, expressed very simply, and worthy of being contemplated. So anyway, there were competing schools of Indian thought. There was Vaisheshika and Nyaya and Yoga and Sankhya and Mimamsa and Vedanta. 6 traditional competing schools of thought within ancient India. And they largely agreed with each other on major topics. But usually there would be 1 or 2 things that each school would think that nobody else thought. Like Vaisheshika Vad is atomic theory in ancient India. And so they postulated that everything was made up of atoms, for instance. And that was grouped together with a school called Nyaya. Nyaya is logic. And Nyaya pretty much agreed with yoga in terms of spiritual practice and Sankhya in terms of philosophy, 2 other schools of Indian thought. But Nyaya concerned itself with how to formulate a cogent argument, syllogisms, and other means of correct formulating of logical propositions. Essentially, it was propositional logic. The law of the excluded middle, and so on and so forth. the law of contradiction. A thing cannot be itself and its opposite in the same way at the same time. Like this, various principles behind propositional logic, those were all discovered in ancient India as well. And they got rigorously codified such that you could study them the same way you would take a logic class. Anyway, so each school had something they did that nobody else did. And then the other schools would take note of it, and they would borrow the logic from Nyaya. And they would, they would borrow from each other and cite references and acknowledge where they were borrowing from, but really make it a point to focus on where they still disagreed. And then write it all down for posterity's sake. And they wrote it down in tight aphorisms that could be memorized. So the entire teaching of a school could be memorized. And then the explanations for all those mnemonic devices would be taught, and you'd be walking around with an entire encyclopedia that was all categorized into a clean hierarchy in your head, because you learned in such a way where each point had a bunch of explanatory notes, and by reciting the verse you would remember the explanatory notes, which would then lead you to the next one, and you had a whole philosophy at your fingertips, and it was all collated nicely. And that's the sutra genre of literature. And I wanted to give you an example of that. So this was all just a warm-up so we could discuss the text at hand. I want to give you guys some appreciation of the tradition, so then when we look at the text at hand, you'll get a sense of, because it's tight, it's an aphorism, it's pregnant, it's got meaning behind it. It was put together over thousands of years ago, and even then it was put together over thousands of years. And it was part of this very, very robust tradition of debate and interfacing with other people with differing beliefs in a way where you were able to move forward and enrich yourselves through discussion, through good argument. Appreciate another person's unique perspective. So within that body of sutras, there's different books for the different schools. One of the schools is Vedanta. Their book is called Vedanta Sutra. It starts off with 570, it is comprised of 570 aphorisms, and it starts off with a couple of verses I want to go over. And so the first two verses of Vedanta Sutra are Atato Brahma Jigyasa. Atta Brahma Jigyasa. Atta means now. So when you put two together, atato, it means now, right now. Like ahorita in Spanish means now. Ahora means now. Ahorita means right this minute. It's Mexican Spanish. And then if you want to mean it like right this very second, what do you say? Ahorita. Right this very second. Ahorita, ahorita. Right now, right this second. So in Sanskrit you say that by saying atato. Atato. There's some contractions involved. Atta becomes atato. Through rules of contraction, like do not becomes don't. For the sake of speech. Instead of saying ataha, which is what you literally have to say ataha. Instead of saying that, you say atato. It's very quick, very smooth. Just like this book is called the Srimad Bhagavat Gita. Srimad Bhagavat Gita. But that's very tough to say because ta is hard and ga is soft and ba is soft. Srimad ba is soft, ta is hard. Srimad Bhagavat Gita. Gita is soft again. So you got two hard T's and two soft syllables, the ba in Bhagavat and the ga in Gita. And so it gets shortened. Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Because da is soft, da becomes ba very easy. Srimad Bhagavad Gita. See how it flows? Srimad Bhagavat Gita. Srimad Bhagavad Gita. It just flows off the tongue. So anyway, that's contractions. So ataha becomes atato. Now, right now, this very second. Brahma Jigyas. inquire about Brahman. Now, right now, inquire about Brahman. And Brahman is then defined in the next verse because we're dealing with a rigorous philosophical text. And when they introduce a new unknown term, the next thing they do is define that term. Just like when you encounter a new word in a Wikipedia entry, they hyperlink it. They won't hyperlink it all throughout every time it occurs, but the first time it occurs, they'll hyperlink it. That way, if you don't know what the word means, you can go down that rabbit hole and start looking up a word, looking up a word, looking up a word. And pretty soon you're 5 hours in. You haven't even said the first thing you want to study because you realize how little you know because you got to look at every single word that they use. And so the next thing they do is they did a hyperlink, an old school hyperlink. Socrates said this. He said the first thing you do is define the terms. Whenever you introduce a term, you have to define it. That way you and the person you're talking to know what you're talking about. Like you could say, I love that movie. And then your wife can say, what do you mean you love that movie? What's wrong with you, you jerk? And you start arguing with her for hours about why you love the movie. But then at some point you realize she doesn't believe the word love should be used to talk about how you feel about a movie. Because she feels love is it's a deep and profound enough emotional state that it should be reserved for things you are devoted to, things you are loyal to, things you have fidelity for. And so when you casually use the term love to describe how much you liked a meal or how much you liked a movie, she's offended because she feels the term love only counts for her or your children or something substantial. And you adulterate the term love by using it casually in a shallow way. And by not defining the term, no, I don't mean that when I say love. I just mean I like it, and it's just a figure of speech. It's a colloquialism. It's a way we speak. But I don't actually love it like I love you, sweetheart. Unless you define the terms, you don't realize where the disconnect was, and you guys have an hour-long argument for no good reason. By defining your terms, you figure out whether you're even having a debate, whether you're even arguing with somebody or not. So, atato brahma jigyasa. Now, right now, inquire. Jigyasa comes from the Sanskrit dhatu gya, gnya, if you want to be real technical, gnya. And that's where you get the English word gnosis from, which means knowledge, which is where you get words like agnostic from. If you don't know whether God exists or not, you're called an agnostic because you don't know. And the Gnostics were this group of Christian and pre-Christian philosophical savants that existed around Greece and the Near East and Galilee and the Levant, that area, around the time of Jesus and before. It was a group of mystics who were in possession of what later became known as alchemical knowledge, alchemy, which is an Arabic term. Algebra, algorithm, alchemy, that al in front of something indicates that the word comes from the Middle East, from Arabic. So even words like agnostic, anyway, they come from this root ya, which means knowledge. And so jigyasa means inquire, gain knowledge, inquire about something. And so atato brahma jigyasa. Most of the words now, right now, inquire, those are obvious, but the word Brahma that you're supposed to inquire about is not clear. So Brahma has to be defined, and the next verse defines Brahman. Jamadi asya yataha. Jamadi yasya yataha. Janma means birth. Adi means etc. And so, just like we have a verse up here, the fourth line of the verse up here, Shrivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Brinda. So we are offering our respects to the Gaura Bhakta Brinda, the family of devotees of Chaitanya, Gaura, Chaitanya, Bhakta, devotees, Brinda, the group of them. We're offering our respects to the group of all the devotees, Shrivas Adi, headed by Shrivas. Shrivas, etc., and all the other Gaura Bhaktas. So in Sanskrit, like in the Gita, it'll say Sparshadi. Sparsha means touch, and Sparshadi means any of the 5 senses. Taste, sight, touch, smell, and sound. They won't say taste, sight, touch, smell, and sound. They'll say sparshadi, touch, etc. And then you fill in the blank. You know, okay, if touch is the first one, then when it says etc., it means all the other things that are like touch, taste, sight, touch, smell, and sound. So jamadi, creation, etc. Jama means birth, but in this case, because it's creation, asya, of the universe. Jamadi asya, the creation of the universe is what's being described. The birth of the universe, therefore you call it creation. The birth of the universe. And when it says etc., the birth, etc. of the universe, what would the etc. stand for? That's a question, non-rhetorical. Again, when you know the known quantity, just like when it says 1, 3, 5, 7, blank, blank, you can fill in 9, 11, because the known quantities are used to figure out the unknown quantities. So when it says jamadi, the birth, etc., asya, of the universe, what does etc. mean?
Everything else within the universe.
Everything else, fair enough, creation, etc. What else does it mean?
Maintenance and dissolution.
There you go. The creation, the growth, the maintenance, the dissolution of this world. See that? Jamadi asya yataha. The birth, growth, dissolution, and everything else of this world in which we live. Yataha. Yatas becomes yataha, also by that contraction rule. So yatas means from whom. Brahma is that thing from whom comes the creation, growth, maintenance, and dissolution of the entire cosmos. That is what Brahman is, according to Vedanta, this core text, in its critical definition of Brahman. The term Brahman had been used in the Upanishadic literatures for millennia prior to the composition of the Vedanta. And the Vedanta was building on a pre-existing revelatory tradition called the Upanishads, but it was rigorously defining the terms which were introduced in the Upanishads, oftentimes because they were revelatory texts. They were ecstatic utterances of sages under meditation, and so they didn't necessarily have a whole systematizing of their thought. And the Vedanta was a systematizing of that ecstatic revelation of these saints and seers. And so if we say, now, right now, inquire about Brahman, and then you go, what's Brahman? And I say, Brahman is that from whom the universe is created, it grows, it's maintained, and it's destroyed. That person from whom, that being from whom, that from whom, that from which. Then what would be the English word that would be a one word in English that would nicely encapsulate the idea of Brahman? God. That's right. The Creator. That's right. So immediately Vedanta makes it clear. It's a theistic text. It believes in the Creator of everything which exists. Do you follow this? Now, when you start to postulate that God's the creator of everything. Now, because the thing is, the English term God, which actually comes from the Sanskrit root who, through, what do I want to say, the drifting of language over thousands of years. The word who, which means to offer. And so therefore God is that person from whom that person to whom things are offered. Eventually became the word God in English. If you look up the word God in an etymological dictionary, it will get you back to the Sanskrit root hu, H-U, which means to offer. Comes words like hutam, the offering of oblations, like in an old Vedic sacrifice. And so, but that term God oftentimes gets saddled with a bunch of ideas like that hell I mentioned beforehand. So we have to sever ourselves from those ideas about a Judeo-Christian God or an Islamic God or an Abrahamic God, because they might have specific ideas about the nature of the deity that is not held by these people. You follow? And so the only thing we know that they believe is a very generic definition. God is that being from which everything comes and into whom everything goes. That, of course, also crushes the idea of a hell which is truly distinct from and isolated from God, because everything exists within the deity, which a doctrine which is technically called panentheism. Panentheism. Pantheism is everything is God. Nature is God. Panentheism is everything is within God, which is an interesting idea because it allows God to simultaneously be immanent, that everything is connected to the divine, but also simultaneously transcendent beyond everything which exists. And so it still allows for a transcendent, otherly quality to God, while at the same time seeing everything in this world as simultaneously being connected to God. That term was coined, panentheism, in the 1850s by the person who founded Indiana University, the University of Indiana, in the 1850s. That term existed within Sanskrit prior to that for thousands of years. It was almost like Western philosophical language is catching up. Krishna said in the Gita thousands of years prior, Te mai na te shvaham. You are in me, I am not in you. The world is in me, I am not in the world. Which again is a super terse statement. Everything is within me and I'm not in everything. What it means is everything is existing within God and dependent on God, but God is not merely the totality of everything which exists, but also just beyond everything as well. Is both immanent of this world and transcendent beyond this world. And the attempt to take those normally antagonistic concepts and weave them together is called panentheism. A systematic attempt to say those things are only paradoxically contradictory. They're not actually a true contradiction. So anyway, jamadi yasya yataha, that thing from which everything comes. That's all we know that's there in the Vedantic conception of divinity. But they have a term for the deity, the creator, and they have a tight definition of the creator that, for me, is worthy of meditation. You shouldn't, it's not that you simply learn this and then you learn how to spell cat or something like that. Or you learn string theory. And you sit there and you think about it. They're big enough ideas that they warrant contemplation. The nature of love, the nature of forgiveness, the nature of compassion. I think, therefore I am. These ideas are beautiful and deep and profound enough that they can't be mastered in one sitting. You need to spend time with them. So, I wanted to show an evolution from Vedanta to the Gita. So this was all just to get to the verse from the Gita that I actually want to study. And we're going to go a little quick. We've done a lot of the preliminary stuff, so the final flourishes should be relatively easy to grasp. But just to recap where we are, Hinduism is not a monolithic religion that can be easily housed under one umbrella term, under one aegis. Rather, ancient India was host to hundreds of different belief systems, some of which were diametrically opposed. But somehow they managed not to have a civil war like everybody did in the Middle East and kill everybody genocidally and turn the world into heathens and Christians or Goyim and Jews or Muslims and infidels as they fought over scarce resources like Bedouins who found God. Rather, they existed in a great civilization where they learned to appreciate each other's points of view, in sharp contrast to how they were considered by C.S. Lewis, bless his heart, as stupid as he was about world religion, as evidenced by his private letters, which somebody published posthumously. And in fact, they did have distinct things to say. They just culturally didn't argue with bullheaded people, especially when those people were their colonizers and might get them into trouble. But amongst themselves, they've been doing polemics, practically speaking, since we were living in caves. And you found this with these traditions that borrowed from one another freely, credited their sources like modern academics do, and then took the trouble to really highlight where they argued, much like you would do in a modern day debate. Where you have a proposition, someone has to take the affirmative and the other person has to take the negative, and you have to agree on what will stand as evidence. And then they wrote down their debates. And those debates were known as the Sutras, where they put down all of their ideas in tight aphorisms, which could be memorized, therefore they were mnemonic, and which were accompanied by voluminous commentary. But somehow the mnemonic device allows you to remember all the commentary, and you're walking around with an encyclopedia in your head because they were really good at teaching. They call it the Sanskrit effect. That when you learn Sanskrit and you memorize large amounts of Sanskrit, it creates all these neural connections between your neurons and your axons, and it staves off things like Alzheimer's disease. You can Google it in Wikipedia. It's called the Sanskrit effect. It's been studied by Western science. And so they wrote these aphorisms down, and they're good. Alla cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. They're worthy of thinking about and meditating on. And so I gave you a couple of verses from Vedanta. Atato Brahma Jigyasa Jamadi Yasya Yataha. Now, right now, you must inquire about Brahman. Brahman is that thing from which the entire universe is born and into which it dissolves. It's profound. It's profound. And so I want to look at the Gita. The Gita has an interesting statement. So again, Jamma Adi Jamadi Asya Yataha. And the Gita says, Pit Aham Asya Jagata Mata. Pit Aham, I am the father. Asya, of this Jagata, of this world. Mata, and the mother. I'm the father and the mother of this universe. I thought this verse is interesting because it uses the same asya jagata, of this world. But instead of saying Brahman is that thing from which the world comes, Krishna takes a step further and says, I'm the mother and the father of this universe. And it's an interesting corollary of conceiving of God as the creator. And this is the main point I want to make, and we'll close with this. When you start to think about God as the creator of the world then becomes the fingerprints or the evidence so that you can understand the nature of divinity. And that's why there's a problem of evil. Because we see suffering and malice existing within this world, and we wonder, why would God create a world with malice? We also see male and female existing within this world, and therefore we start to think of God as the father and the mother, because we see the ubiquitousness, the all-pervasiveness of masculine and feminine within all, practically speaking, all created beings, even down to plants and seeds. And you start to get a sense of what your father looked like by looking at you, of what your father looked like by looking at you, of what your children are going to look like by looking at you. And as we're looking for that remote deity, that source, that abstract, difficult to see, invisible creator, the unseen seer, the unmoved mover, the beginning that has always existed. Similar in many ways to how we think of things like quantum, fundamental particles, and fundamental forces. No one asks, where does gravity come from? They just introduce gravity as an all-pervasive eternal force of reality. They introduce subatomic particles like bosons as all-pervasive eternal features of reality. Neutrinos, subneutron particles, neutrinos. Our microscopes are big enough we can see that stuff now. Or at least we can see the aftermath of that stuff. We can't actually see it, we can see the aftermath of it. And so in the same way that physics postulates fundamental particles and fundamental forces that are just introduced as axioms from which the creation is built, similarly within theism, philosophically, God is introduced as an axiom from which the world is built. And then when you look at the world, you see evidence. And what do we see evidence? We see free will. We see consciousness. We see truth. We see logic. This leads to statements like, in the beginning was Logos, and Logos was Theos, from the book of John. In the beginning was logic, and logic was divine. You see things in this world that make sense, that are all pervasive, that seem to be the way and the weft of the world, the thread that ties the world together, and you decide, hey, wait a second. That must be the fingerprints of the deity. That Fibonacci sequence. Consciousness. Free will. Love. Truth. Beauty. That's why the Greeks defined God as the good, the true, and the beautiful. They were seeing these most wonderful features of creation. They were troubleshooting the negative features, which largely consists of blaming them on us. And they were positing that the natural world was beautiful and that it was close to divinity. And they were looking for the best things in the world, and they were understanding that to be the fingerprints of, the remnants of, the evidence of God. And so it's interesting how you see the Vedanta, in some ways, evolving in the Gita, where Krishna doesn't just say, it's not just that Brahman is that thing from which everything comes, but Krishna takes a step further and he personalizes the relationship that he has with the world. He's the father and the mother of the world. And these are wild ideas. To conceive of God as being the mother and the father of the world, it's very natural. It's almost innate. And that mother aspect, thinking about God as a divine feminine, is powerful and largely today subversive. If you look at the world of religion, 5 billion Christians and Muslims, 500,000 to 3/4 of a billion Catholics, and you were to look at, say over 4 billion people don't really think about the divine feminine. There is a Shekinah and a Sufi Islam, and it's not like there's no feminine conceptions ever to be found in any tradition. But if you look at the majority of Christianity, they don't have much of a conception of the divine feminine. And almost all of Islam. And what a beautiful thing it is to reflect on God as being both your mother and your father, nurturing you and protecting you, giving birth to you. Krishna later on in the Gita says, Mama yoni garbham dadami. My womb, I place the seed in my womb and create the universe. Sexualizing the metaphor, to use both masculine images of the masculine and feminine genitalia. My mama yoni, my womb. Garbham dadamyaham. I place the seed in my womb to give rise to the cosmos. And so anyway, today as I was walking over, I thought of Vedanta and I thought of this verse from the Gita. It came to my mind. And I thought about the commonality and the themes they're describing, but how there's a difference in the impact of the language and how personalizing the language is very, very potent and powerful. Normally, because of Greek philosophy, most philosophical people nowadays, they think that the more spiritual you get, the less you think of God in personal terms, until eventually you think of God as an idea, or the ground of being, or the ultimate abstraction. It comes from Plato's realm of forms. It comes from different Hellenic modes of thinking, which were largely impersonal, and like to think of God as being via negativa, by way of negation. Thomas Aquinas, the father of Catholic theology, he said you cannot say what God is, you can only say what God is not. It's called via negativa philosophy or apophatic philosophy. The first instance of that, the apophatic philosophy, via negativa, God is not this, actually occurs in the Upanishads. Thousands of years before you find it anywhere else. So we're no stranger to that. We call it neti, not this, not this. But we also have via positiva philosophy, where we describe what God is. And the thing is, if God created the universe includes us. The universe includes consciousness. It includes the capacity for love. It includes the capacity for thought. So if God created the world, God would naturally have those attributes. And when you think about emergent phenomena, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but when you think of emergent phenomenon like traffic jams, for example, you can trace out that emergent phenomenon that appears to take on a life of its own and show how ultimately it's distillable down to its precursor conditions. And it makes perfect sense. It just is difficult to fathom until you really work it out. When looking at things like consciousness and free will, it's impossible to fathom the precursor conditions that would give rise to them. And therefore, they should properly be seen as basic features of reality. And therefore, the deity that gave rise to them would also have to have those basic features. And if you come from the divine, and you're conscious, and you have free will and the capacity for love, that means that God also has those features. And these deep, profound thoughts about the nature of a loving deity and the capacity for us to interact with that deity and the consciousness of the divine are all encoded in simple statements like this. I'm the mother and father of the universe. You start to think about that and reflect on it, and you can spend a lifetime doing that and come to some really deep truths. And so Vedanta did that. They tried to pack a wallop, put a tempest in a teapot. They tried to put some really deep philosophy to really simple things so you could memorize them, reflect on them, think about them, talk about them with other people, compare them to other competing ideas, and have a progressive discussion and a progressive life. That's it. Thank you very much. Let's do a little kirtan. Hare Krishna.